Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on the JayBee Milly channel. I am JayBee and today I'm going to be giving my first impressions of the 8th episode of Velma. Now this is coming fresh off me just watching it, so maybe the thoughts are going to be quite raw and mostly unedited because this is literally my first impression of the episode. But before we get into that, please consider subscribing. Even if you're not a fan of the Velma series, we have done over 70 interviews with people that have worked on the Scooby-Doo franchise, from things such as Scooby-Doo Where Are You, all the way back in 1969, to Trick or Treat Scooby-Doo, that was just released a couple of months ago. So if you do want to check that out, please do subscribe, and we hope to see you for future videos. Now, a bit of a spoiler warning, for all we try and shy away from spoilers for the most part in these videos, when some things are kind of too obvious to not speak about, we will be discussing it, but the backdrop won't change, so you're not going to see any screenshots or anything like that in this video. But if you do want to go into it completely spoiler free, I recommend watching the episode of Velma and then coming back and maybe telling us what you thought about the episode. That'd definitely be good to get that type of dialogue in the comment section down below. But without further ado, let's get into it. First and foremost, I'm really not a fan of the way this episode is structured at all. I kind of think that, again, like I said with last episode, to me the last episode felt like something that should have been established more in episode 3 or 4. And I suppose by the same token then, this is something that maybe should have been established in episode 5 or 6. The type of episode that was meant to build intrigue, but it ultimately went nowhere. And I guess what I mean by that is, perhaps this is a personal preference, but I'm not a big fan of shows that start off in one place. We see our characters in a crazy and wacky situation, and then this big obnoxious black screen comes on the TV with huge white writing, and it says, 2 days later, this person's point of view. And they do make fun of that in the show, but like I've said since episode 1, just because you point something out and make fun of it, it doesn't mean it isn't there. So it doesn't get a get out of jail free card in my books just because it pointed that out. And ultimately, I think in any TV show I don't like this structure because, of course, you have an intrigue of how do our characters get to that situation, like what has led to that. And that works maybe for the first 2 minutes, but then every single situation you see our characters getting in, it's like, what jeopardy are they in? What are they going to find out? Because ultimately we know where they're getting to. It's kind of like my issues with prequels or just their own narrative device. Say, I think back to watching Captain America the First Avenger, and I wasn't having an awful time watching that movie, but ultimately it's like, okay, Avengers is coming next year. I'm really excited for that. How are we going to get this guy in the ice? Which is not an ideal mindset when we're supposedly meant to be getting invested in relationships in that movie. It's a little bit like that to me. Maybe on a lot less of a scale, but it's like, okay, I want to see the gang in that situation. So why are we messing around having a tongue-in-cheek conversation about different types of writing styles and flashbacks? Although, I'm glad to say that Fred, as usual with me, I know it's a bit of an unpopular opinion, but Fred is actually saving the first section of this episode for me right now with his dialogue. It's kind of cringe, but I think if you look around the context of that, there's a lot that we can infer about the plot and maybe where we see things going forward in terms of the true identity of the villain and who is innocent and who is guilty. I think there's a good discussion to have there. But ultimately, there's not enough Fred in the first part of this episode, and too much, not nonsense, but too much episode 1 and 2 stuff, like drama that Daphne and Velma are having, that we established in an episode before, and then we established it again in an episode before, and then for good measure, we established it another time before, and now we're back to the same thing again. It's kind of like, are we going to have any growth, or have you just had one idea for a character that you're going to keep recycling over and over again just to remind us about how edgy the show is? So I really was not a fan of a lot of this episode, both from its structure to what it achieves, and there was a lot that didn't land for me. I didn't think it was a particularly funny episode. Again, even the stuff with Fred didn't really work. Now, there is this one section where we see some outside forces intervening on the gang's eventual location, and that got a laugh out of me. But luckily, I'm thanking my lucky stars that the flashback sequencey stuff doesn't go on terribly long. And what I mean by that is it probably lasts about half the episode, which is only 10 minutes. So in terms of the episode in general, I guess it was a long time. But in terms of just having to sit through it, it wasn't terribly long whatsoever. I just think it was unnecessary because they had a pretty decent episode on their hands without the flashback, but it was maybe too short. I can definitely see that being the case. So maybe they were just like, oh, we don't have enough content to justify this being its own episode. Shall we just drag it out a bit? Because really, the contents of this episode, in actual fact, could have taken up half of a other episode. So I don't know if they had like a quota to fill in terms of episode count or whatever, but honestly, it didn't do anything for me at all, the first half of this whatsoever. The second half wasn't too much better. I mean, it's more or less the same. We've got one side of the team arguing, and then we've got Fred more or less by himself, just being a bit weird. And that's the episode summed up. It's a far cry from the last episode where we got some character dynamics, we got some good progress being made, some catharsis, and also some more clues about the villain's intentions. But here it's like I can't find any Easter eggs, I can't find any plot to move things forward, I can't find any humour in it. Like, if you were to ask me honestly what this episode achieved, I guess there's a massive revelation at the end, but then that type of revelation in this series so far on that scale, or I guess to take that amount of time, has been done as a joke for 1 second, or has been done as a post-credit scene. So really, we could have just had whatever episode 9 was going to be, but this just be the last moments of this episode, just be the epilogue or the prologue, I guess. But I guess they couldn't do that. I guess it just wasn't possible. They had to drag it out. By the same point, though, we do get a deeper look into the insight of some of the victims, if that's not too spoilery. I mean, I guess it's pretty obvious that we're going to learn about them, so learn about them we do. And it just seems a bit too convenient. There's just things that aren't adding up. But I do feel like some of the questions that I do have after this episode will be answered. And that's one thing I've got to say. I do think overall that episodes 7 and 8 are infinitely better than episode 5 and 6. Because I really left those 2 episodes not caring at all. And now I'm not like on the edge of my seat, like, oh, I can't wait for next week to come round. It's like going to be the best thing ever. But I'm intrigued, to say the least. Like, I really want to see what happens next. And maybe wondering if some of my theories will be vindicated. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. But I think it was a mistake to not have the whole gang fully together after last episode. I think last episode was meant to be our kind of moment where the Avengers assemble, we get all our gang together, and it's like that Stranger Things moment. We go through the season where there's different subgroups, they're all doing different things that are ultimately working toward the same goal, but then they all kind of come together to defeat the big bad. And I think we got a perfect, almost, I would say, textbook version of that in the last episode, and then they just kind of went, nah, never mind, and then went back to the usual formula for this episode. So that was very frustrating that they kind of undid a lot of progress that was made last time. But ultimately, it does seem like now they really do have to be together for our episodes 9 and 10. Like, they absolutely have to. Because that's the dynamic that people want. I know it's called Velma, but the dynamic that people like is the gang, and we're never going to replace Scooby, but that was imposed upon the showrunners, supposedly. Now, from what I understand, nothing is imposing them to not have the gang together minus Scooby. That's completely fine. So I would be personally disappointed if the whole gang went together in episode 9. And we do start to see the seeds of Mystery Inc. be planted, which, in my opinion, is pretty good. I mean, you'd expect that from a prequel at this point. Think about, say, the Scooby-Doo, The Mystery Begins. You've got to have those obligatory little nods to what's gonna come and what we know is gonna happen. So I don't have a big issue with that, but the difference between Mystery Begins and this is this didn't really hype me up the same, because it was just, I was more confused maybe than like, yeah, look at that. So that's kind of my thoughts. I am going to make another video straight after this breaking down who I think is going to be the culprits, who's like my top suspects. So please do stick around for that. And if you do want to see more, then please like, comment, and subscribe to JayBee Milly, and we'll see you next time.